My name is Evelyn Moore. I was 28 years old when my mother decided to strip me down to a single word in front of everyone who mattered to her. She didn't do it in a hallway or behind a closed door. She waited until Thanksgiving dinner, until the candles were lit, the wine had loosened tongues, and the table was full of people whose opinions she valued more than my dignity. She looked straight at me, smiled like she was offering a correction, and said, "November is your last month here." Then she added calmly, almost kindly, "We've carried you long enough. You're a leech." The room froze, not in outrage, in compliance. My uncle stared into his plate. A family friend let out a short, nervous laugh like it was a joke he didn't want to understand. Someone's child asked what a leech was, and an adult answered too quickly. My mother waited, certain I would react the way she needed me to. Cry, argue, apologize. I didn't. I reached for the gravy, passed it to my left, and swallowed the truth I already knew. If they truly believed I was a burden, then losing me shouldn't hurt at all. The conversation crept back to life in pieces, as if nothing had happened. Someone commented on the turkey being dry. Another person asked about holiday travel plans. Forks clinked against plates. The moment passed, the way moments always do when no one wants to claim responsibility for them. On the outside, I played along. I nodded when spoken to. I smiled when expected. I let the evening move forward at its careful, polite pace. On the inside, something shifted. Not cracked, not shattered, settled. Thanksgiving had always been my mother's stage. She chose the guest list carefully, neighbors with impressive jobs, friends from her volunteer board, a couple who owned a local business she liked to reference when she talked about connections. This dinner wasn't about family, it was about image, about presenting a household that functioned smoothly, where generosity flowed one way and authority flowed another. I had been part of that image for a while, a detail she liked to control. A daughter who had come back home, a story she told with a practiced sigh that earned sympathy without inviting questions. No one at the table knew why I was there. Not really. They knew the version my mother preferred. That I'd had trouble finding my footing. That I was still figuring things out. That I was lucky she was patient enough to help me. She never mentioned that I worked full-time. She never mentioned that my stay was meant to be temporary. And she certainly never mentioned the parts of the household that quietly depended on me. That wasn't her story to tell. When the plates were cleared and dessert arrived, my mother relaxed. The performance had gone exactly as planned. She laughed louder, refilled glasses, told a story about a charity auction that made her look generous and discerning. She did not look at me again. In her mind, the matter was settled. She had drawn a line in public, where lines are hardest to challenge. She believed she had reminded everyone, including me, of where I stood. I stayed until the end because leaving early would have given her the reaction she wanted. I hugged people goodbye. I thanked her for dinner. I listened to someone tell me softly that things would work out. I nodded like I believed it. When I went upstairs that night, the house was already settling into its familiar quiet. The kind that assumes everything will be handled the next morning without asking who does the handling. I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed a moment to acknowledge what had finally become clear. I had spent months explaining myself to people who weren't listening, trying to justify my presence in a space that only valued me when I was useful. That word, leech, wasn't a slip. It was a decision. One she had made long before she said it out loud. Sleep didn't come easily, but it didn't evade me either. My thoughts felt sharper than my emotions, as if my mind had already reached a conclusion my heart was still catching up to. I replayed the dinner once, then stopped. There was nothing left to analyze there. The truth didn't live at that table. It lived in everything that had led up to it. I had moved back into my mother's house just under a year earlier. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because she asked. She framed it as concern, as a temporary arrangement that would help us both. I told myself it made sense. I had the flexibility. She had the space. It would be easier, she said, with me there. Easier had become her favorite word. Easy for her often meant invisible work for someone else. At first, the arrangement felt neutral. I kept my routines. I paid my own expenses. I stayed out of her way. Slowly, without ceremony, that neutrality shifted. I noticed how often she deferred certain things in my direction, how she stopped asking and started assuming, how my presence smoothed over complications she didn't want to think about. It wasn't malicious. It didn't need to be. Comfort can be just as consuming as cruelty. The house functioned because someone paid attention. Someone noticed details before they became problems. Someone understood how things were connected. I had always been good at that. Seeing systems, anticipating consequences, filling gaps before they widened. I never announced it. I didn't need praise. I just didn't expect to be reduced to a punchline in front of strangers. By the time November arrived, the pattern felt permanent. My mother spoke about me as if I were a phase she had tolerated long enough. Her patience, she implied, was running out. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so deliberate. She liked the benefits of my presence. She resented the reminder that she needed them. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke before the house stirred. The sky outside was gray and low, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished. I sat on the edge of the bed again, not out of habit this time, but out of recognition. There was nothing left to negotiate. No speech to rehearse, no apology to prepare. I wasn't angry. Anger would have meant I still hoped for something different. I moved quietly, though I no longer felt the need to. Packing took less time than I expected. I owned fewer things than most people my age. Not because I lacked means, but because I had learned not to claim too much space. Clothes, work materials, a small stack of notebooks, documents I kept organized because someone always had to. Everything fit into 2 bags and an old carry-on I'd kept from a previous life. As I packed, I thought about how often I had told myself this situation was temporary. How often temporary arrangements become permanent when no one challenges them. My mother would wake up later and find my room empty. She would tell herself I was being dramatic. She would tell others I couldn't handle criticism. She would not mention what she had said, or how she had said it, or why. I carried my bags downstairs and set them by the door. The house was still silent. I paused in the kitchen, not out of sentiment, but out of awareness. I had learned every sound that place made, the way the floor creaked near the sink, the hum of appliances working exactly as expected. Systems running smoothly because someone ensured they did. I left the keys on the counter, visible and unceremonious. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Stepping outside felt lighter than I anticipated. The air was cold, clean in a way that reset your lungs. I loaded my bags into the car and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, not to gather courage, but to acknowledge the decision. This wasn't escape. It was alignment. I was stepping out of a role that had been assigned to me without consent. The drive away from the house was short, but it felt definitive. I didn't look back. Some places don't deserve nostalgia. I had secured a small apartment earlier in the week, quietly, without announcing it. The building was older. The hallway smelled faintly of paint and dust, but the door opened to a space that was entirely mine. No expectations attached. No history pressing in from the walls. I set my bags down and stood in the middle of the room, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. It didn't feel empty. It felt honest. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and let the silence settle. For the first time in months, I wasn't anticipating anyone else's needs. I wasn't calculating how my presence might be interpreted. I was just there. My phone buzzed once, then again. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to see the messages to know what they would say. Questions framed like inconveniences, confusion that assumed continuity, an expectation that whatever I had been doing would continue, regardless of where I was. I turned the phone face down and let it go quiet again. That was when I understood the full shape of what my mother had done at that table. She hadn't just tried to shame me, she had underestimated me. She believed my value ended where her authority began. She believed that calling me a leech would make me shrink, would make me scramble to prove my worth. She didn't know what I carried. She didn't know what I held together. And she didn't know how quickly absence can teach lessons that words never will. I didn't know who would show up at my door the next day, or how fast the balance would shift once I stepped out of it. I only knew this. I had stopped explaining myself, and the silence I left behind was about to speak much louder than I ever had. The morning after I left felt quieter than I expected. Not empty, just unclaimed. I woke up before my alarm in a room that smelled like paint and old wood and coffee from somewhere downstairs. The light through the blinds was thin and gray, and for a moment I lay still, listening to nothing demand my attention. No footsteps, no television murmuring from another room, no sense that I needed to move carefully to avoid being noticed, or, worse, needed. As I sat up, my mind went backward without permission, not to the dinner table but to the decision that had brought me back to my mother's house in the first place. It surprised me how calm that memory felt now. At the time, it had seemed reasonable, even responsible. She had called late one evening, voice measured, not panicked, saying she needed help with a transition. She did not say emergency. She did not say crisis. She said practical, temporary, easier if we handled it together. I remember standing in my own kitchen back then, phone tucked between my shoulder and ear, looking at a half-packed grocery bag and thinking that this was what adults did for family. She talked about space and timing and how it would be good for both of us. She said she hated asking. She said she knew I had my own life. She said just a few months. I said yes before she finished her sentence. The first weeks felt neutral, almost polite. I kept my routine. I left early. I came back late. I paid my share without discussion. She introduced me to people as her daughter who was staying for a bit, always adding that she was happy to have me. The words sounded generous. The tone carried something else. Gratitude was implied but never stated. It did not bother me then. I told myself not everything needed to be acknowledged to be fair. She had always been good at keeping things orderly on the surface. The house looked the same as it always had. Clean counters. A calendar on the fridge with neat handwriting. Neighbors waved when they saw her. It was easy to believe everything was under control. I believed it too, at least at first. When she asked me to help with something small, I did not hesitate. It was framed as a favor, nothing more. The shift was so gradual that I did not notice it until it had already settled in. A document left on the counter for me to look over. A reminder passed along casually, as if it were already understood I would handle it. The language changed without announcement. It moved from could you to you can just. I did not push back because it did not feel heavy yet. I had room to carry it. I told myself it would even out. What made it harder to see was how often she spoke about me as if I were still adrift. She never lied outright. She just edited. She talked about my age as if it were a liability. She described my work as flexible in a way that suggested expendable. When people asked how long I planned to stay, she answered for me, saying we would see, as if my plans were open-ended even when they were not. There was someone else she liked to compare me to. A sibling who fit her idea of progress better. A life that looked complete on paper. I was not jealous. I was aware. Praise flowed easily in one direction. In mine, it arrived as correction. She told me I had potential as if that were consolation. She said she worried about me as if worry justified control. I remember one afternoon when I came home exhausted and found her on the phone, laughing. She covered the receiver and told me she had told her friend how nice it was to have me around to help with things. I nodded, too tired to unpack the sentence. Help had replaced stay. Around had replaced live. I felt a flicker of unease and dismissed it. Families help each other. That was the story I had been raised on. The expectations stacked quietly. One responsibility led to another, not because anyone demanded it, but because it made sense to keep things consistent. I became the person who followed through, the person who noticed when something needed attention before it became urgent, the person who remembered dates and details and connections. When things worked, no one commented. When something almost failed, my involvement became obvious only as a suggestion of fault. I did not realize how invisible the work was until a small mistake slipped through. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to prompt a comment about how I should have caught it. The word should landed heavier than the mistake itself. It was the first time I understood that my role had changed without my consent. Help had turned into expectation. Expectation had turned into obligation. My mother never thanked me. Not because she was cruel, but because gratitude would have acknowledged dependence. She preferred to keep that blurred. She accepted outcomes and dismissed process. She stayed removed from the details while benefiting from their resolution. When something required explanation, she waved it off, saying I was better at those things. The praise sounded like trust. It functioned like distance. I coped by shrinking my needs. I ate later. I spoke less. I learned to anticipate moods and avoid friction. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself peace was worth the cost. What I did not tell myself was how tired I was becoming, how the quiet resentment settled into my chest and stayed there, not sharp enough to force action, just steady enough to drain me. There were moments when the imbalance showed itself clearly, a decision made without consulting me that affected my time, a plan announced as if I were automatically available, a joke about how reliable I was that made others laugh and made me feel smaller. Each time, I felt the urge to say something rise and fall away. I did not want to be difficult. I did not want to be accused of ingratitude. The story my mother told about me solidified as the months passed. She spoke of carrying me. She spoke of patience. She spoke of generosity. It was a story that placed her at the center and pushed me to the edges. I overheard parts of it once, through a half-closed door. She said I was lucky. She said I was still finding myself. She said she did not mind. The last part hurt the most. Mind implied burden. I began to understand that correcting the narrative would not change it. The people who benefited from it had no incentive to revise it. My silence made it easier for them to believe it. I stayed because I hoped effort would eventually be seen. I stayed because leaving felt like failure. I stayed because family was supposed to mean something beyond accounting. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs lined up clearly. At the time, they blended into routine. I had not yet reached the point where the cost outweighed the reason. That point came later, at a table set with food and witnesses. But the ground had already shifted long before that night. As I stood in my new kitchen that morning, kettle heating, I felt the weight of that realization settle fully. I had not returned home because I needed saving. I had returned because I was asked. Somewhere along the way, that choice had been reframed as dependence. The difference mattered. It always had. I poured hot water into a mug and watched the steam rise. The quiet did not feel lonely. It felt honest. I thought about how many times I had ignored the small voice telling me something was wrong because it did not scream. I promised myself I would listen now, even if what it said was uncomfortable. My phone stayed face down on the counter. I did not need to read anything yet. There would be time for that. For the moment, I let myself stand there, breathing in the unfamiliar air, aware that the story of how I became invisible had ended. Another story was already forming, one I would not need permission to tell. A few months into living there, the favors stopped feeling like favors and started feeling like the house had quietly decided I was part of its operating system. It happened in small ways that were easy to shrug off in the moment, the kind of shifts you only recognize later when you realize you have been walking a different direction for a long time. The first time I noticed it, it was a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary night that never warns you it is about to become a pattern. I came home from work with my shoulders tight and my head still buzzing, and my mother was at the kitchen table with a stack of mail spread out like a game she expected me to play. She looked up and gave me a tired smile. "I need you to take a look at this," she said, tapping the top envelope. "They keep sending it, and I do not have time to deal with it right now." I did not even ask what it was. I washed my hands, set my bag down, and sat where she indicated. It was a notice about a renewal. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. I scanned it, made a couple of calls, and handled it in less than 15 minutes. When I hung up, she nodded like I had done what I was supposed to do and went back to scrolling on her phone. Thank you did not come. It did not need to, I told myself. It was family. It was simple. It was just this once. But a week later, another envelope appeared. Then another. Then a message from her in the middle of my workday, asking if I could swing by somewhere on my way home because she had an appointment and could not be bothered to reschedule. The tone was casual, like I was being included in the planning rather than assigned a task. I texted back, "I can do it." I did not want to fight over something small. Small turned into routine. Routine turned into expectation. The wording changed first. At the beginning, it was "can you," and sometimes I would even hear her add "if you have time." Then it became "you should," and later, "you need to." It was subtle, almost polite, but it carried weight. When she said it like the conversation had already happened and the decision had already been made. One afternoon, she called while I was in the grocery store. Her voice had that thin edge it got when something did not go her way. "I cannot get into that account," she said. "The password is not working." "Which account?" I asked, holding my phone with one hand and a carton of eggs with the other. "The one for the homeowner stuff," she said. "You set it up. I need you to fix it." I could have said, "I set it up because you asked me to." I could have said, "You can reset your own password." Instead, I said, "Okay, I will look at it when I get home." When I walked in later, she was sitting on the couch watching a cooking show like nothing had happened. I stood behind her, found the login page on her tablet, and reset the password in minutes. She did not look up. "Good," she said. "I knew you would figure it out." That sentence sat oddly in my chest. Not "thank you." Not "I appreciate it." Just, "I knew you would." As if my ability existed for her convenience. The responsibility kept stacking in ways that made sense if you were already holding the last piece. I became the person who kept track of dates, who verified information, who remembered which card had been used where, who spoke to customer service when something went wrong because my mother hated being on hold and always sounded too impatient to get what she needed. She would hand me the phone mid-call and say, "You talk to them, you are calmer." It sounded like praise. It functioned like a transfer. A few weeks after that, she invited people over for a small get-together, neighbors and a couple from her volunteer board, the kind of event she loved because it made her feel important. I came home to the smell of candles and the sound of her laugh rising over polite conversation. She waved me in like I was part of the decor. "This is Evelyn," she said to a woman I had never met. "My daughter. She is staying with me for a bit and helping me get organized." I do not know what I would do without her." The woman smiled warmly. "You are lucky," she said. "Good daughters are rare." My mother nodded as if she had earned me. I stood there with a dish towel in my hands, feeling like a prop. She had said the words that sounded like appreciation, but the way she said them made me feel smaller, like my value was in how well I supported her storyline. No one asked what I did with my days. No one asked what it cost me. It was assumed that helping was simply who I was. Later that night, after everyone left, I started loading the dishwasher. My mother leaned against the counter and looked pleased with herself. "You did good tonight," she said, and I felt a brief flicker of relief until she added, "I mean, you made it easy. You are so good at handling details." The relief faded. Easy. That word again. Easy for her meant invisible for me. The house began to treat my attention like a utility. If something needed to be handled, it drifted in my direction without anyone noticing the drift. If something went smoothly, it belonged to the house itself, as if stability was the natural state, and my effort was unnecessary. I noticed it most when a problem was avoided, when something almost went wrong, when a deadline was close, or an error could have become expensive, and I corrected it before anyone else even knew it existed. There was no moment afterward where someone said, "I am glad you caught that." The problem never happened, so my work never happened either. It disappeared into the clean surface of their lives. That invisibility did something to me. It made me doubt myself in a way I did not expect. If no one noticed, maybe it was not real. If no one acknowledged it, maybe I was being dramatic. I started keeping mental receipts without meaning to, counting the small things just to prove to myself that I was not imagining the imbalance. Then the blame began, and that is what made it undeniable. It started as a joke, the kind people tell when they want to correct you without owning the cruelty. One evening, my mother was frustrated because something did not load properly on her laptop. She sighed loudly, clicked a few keys, and then looked at me. "I swear, ever since you touched this thing, it has been acting weird," she said, with a half smile. I had not touched it. I had been in my room, but the suggestion landed anyway. The idea that I was now responsible not just for solutions, but for any irritation that happened within the walls. I started to hear similar comments from other family members. Not direct accusations, just little nudges. If the trash went out late, someone would say, "I thought you were on top of that stuff." If a date was missed, someone would ask if I forgot. The assumption was always that I was the manager, not the participant. The strangest part was how quickly people adjust to the idea that you will carry something. Once they believe it, they stop building their own muscle. They stop remembering. They stop trying. Their dependence grows while your effort becomes a baseline, no longer impressive, no longer worth mentioning. And when you struggle under the weight, they look at you like you are being difficult. I remember the moment it became painfully clear. My mother had scheduled something important, a meeting connected to her volunteer work, and she mentioned it at dinner like it was my responsibility too. "You will drive me," she said, without looking up from her plate. I paused. I was working that day. "I have a shift," I said carefully. "I cannot take off on short notice." She finally looked at me. The look was not angry. It was disappointed, like I had broken an agreement I had never made. "Well," she said, "I told them I would be there. I cannot reschedule. I assumed you would handle it." Handle it? Like it was a package. Like I was a service. I could feel the familiar urge to fix it rising in me, to rearrange my life, to make it work. I wanted to avoid the tension that would follow if I said no. That was the trap. The family had learned that my discomfort was easier for me to manage than theirs. I took a breath. "I can call a ride service for you," I said. Her lips tightened. "I do not want a stranger driving me," she said. This is what family is for. There it was. Obligation dressed up as morality. I did not argue. I went back to eating, but my appetite was gone. All night the sentence replayed in my mind. This is what family is for. Not love, not support, not mutual care, just access. The next day, when I came home, there was a folder on the counter with my name written on a sticky note. Not the kind of folder you forget about, the kind you place deliberately. I opened it, and my stomach tightened. It was paperwork for something larger than the everyday. Forms, numbers, a signature line. And there, in more than one place, my name was listed in connection to it, as if I had agreed to be involved. I stood there with the papers in my hands, hearing the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of my mother moving upstairs. My pulse slowed, not because I was calm, but because a different kind of awareness had taken over. This was not just errands and accounts and convenience. This was something that could follow me beyond the house. My mother came down a few minutes later, saw the folder open, and did not look surprised. "Oh, good," she said. "You found it. I need you to sign those. It is just standard. It will make things smoother." "Smoother for who?" I asked. She sighed like I was slowing her down. "For us," she said. "For the house. Do not make it complicated, Evelyn. You always do this thing where you overthink." Overthink. Another word she loved. It meant, do not question me. I looked at the signature line again. I did not sign. I set the papers back in the folder and closed it carefully. "I will read through it first," I said. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Why?" she asked. "Do you not trust me?" The question was a trap, and we both knew it. If I said I did not trust her, I would be the problem. If I said I did, she would get what she wanted. I chose neither. I said, "I trust myself to understand what I am signing." Her face changed in a way that chilled me. The smile was still there, but it was thinner. "Fine," she said, "but do not take forever. We have deadlines." I carried the folder to my room and closed the door. My hands shook a little as I sat on the bed and turned the pages slowly. The more I read, the more my unease sharpened into something clear. This was not a favor. This was a commitment. Something that could tie me to decisions and responsibilities I had not agreed to carry. I thought about all the times I had said yes because it was easier. All the times I had softened my boundaries to keep the peace. All the times I had hoped someone would notice the weight. That folder was proof that no one was going to notice until it became inconvenient for them. They would keep adding weight as long as I kept standing. I stared at the pages until the words blurred. A dull ache sat behind my ribs. It was not just anger. It was grief. The kind that comes when you realize the people you love have been taking from you without seeing you as a person who can run out. That night at dinner, my mother chatted about holiday plans like nothing had happened. She mentioned how busy the next few weeks would be, how many things needed to be handled, how grateful she was to have help. Help. Again. The word that sounded gentle and felt heavy. I listened without interrupting. I watched how easily she assumed my time belonged to her. I watched how comfortable she was with that assumption. And I felt something in me pull back. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly, like a tide receding. I did not know what I would do yet. I only knew the old arrangement was over, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Later, in my room, I placed the folder on my desk and sat beside it, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly. Outside my door, the house continued its familiar rhythm, confident that tomorrow would look like yesterday. I let that confidence sit there, untouched, while I looked down at my name on those pages and understood, with a steadiness that surprised me, that I could not keep being the person they leaned on without permission. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what would happen when I stopped holding the weight. I did not stop doing the things that kept the house running after that night. Not right away. I moved through the next days with the same quiet efficiency, but something had shifted inside me. Awareness has weight. Once you see the shape of what you are carrying, it presses differently on your shoulders. I began to notice how often problems never reached anyone else because I intercepted them first. A notice that arrived with a deadline that would have caused panic if missed. A setting that needed adjusting before it triggered a penalty. A conversation that required calm persistence instead of irritation. I handled each one the way I always had, quickly and without drama, but now I saw the pattern clearly. The house did not function because everyone contributed. It functioned because I anticipated what no one else wanted to track. The strange thing was how little curiosity there was about any of it. When something worked, it was assumed to be simple. If I mentioned a complication, my mother waved it away, saying it sounded like more trouble than it was worth. She did not want to understand the mechanics. Understanding would have meant responsibility. It was easier for her to believe that these things took care of themselves, or that I had some natural talent that made effort unnecessary. She liked to stay removed from details. She knew just enough to benefit, never enough to be accountable. When something required attention, she redirected it toward me with a familiar phrase, telling me I was better at this sort of thing. That sentence did more than shift work. It established distance. It kept her above the process while grounding me in it. There was a moment, about a week after the folder appeared, when the imbalance revealed itself so clearly that I had to sit down. It was late afternoon. The house was quiet except for the low hum of appliances and the ticking of the wall clock. I was sorting through a stack of papers when I noticed a discrepancy, a small error that could have become something much larger if left alone. The kind of thing that does not announce itself until it has already caused damage. My pulse quickened as I traced it back through dates and entries. It was not my mistake. It was not even a mistake made recently. It had been there for a while, buried under assumptions. I corrected it, documented the change, and followed up where necessary. By the time I finished, the risk was gone. Nothing bad had happened, no alarms, no consequences. I sat there afterward, hands resting on the table, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room. If I had not caught it, the fallout would have been immediate and visible. Questions would have been asked. Blame would have followed. And somehow I knew the blame would have found its way to me anyway. That was the part that unsettled me most. I was responsible whether I acted or not. I did not feel proud. I felt exposed. I realized then that my position was both indispensable and powerless. I was holding systems together without authority, absorbing risk without recognition. That is not power in the way people imagine it. It is a liability. I began taking a quiet inventory, not on paper, just in my mind. I traced connections, accounts, timelines, dependencies. I saw how one thing led to another, how a delay in one area rippled outward. It became clear how quickly things would unravel if I stepped away. Not dramatically at first. Quietly. Missed steps. Overlooked details. The kind of failures that accumulate until someone finally asks what went wrong. An external comment made it even clearer. I was standing in line at a cafe near my work when someone I recognized from one of my mother's activities tapped my shoulder. She smiled and asked how things were going at the house, then mentioned how relieved everyone was that I was handling so much behind the scenes. She said it casually, as if it were common knowledge. I nodded, said something polite, and walked away with my coffee shaking slightly in my hand. The reach of my involvement extended further than my mother realized, or pretended not to. Others assumed I was the point of contact, the steady presence keeping everything aligned. Inside the house, my role was minimized. Outside, it was taken for granted. For a brief moment, I considered explaining everything to my mother, sitting her down, laying out the full scope of what I managed, showing her the interconnections she never wanted to see. I imagined her expression, the mix of disbelief and irritation. I imagined how quickly the conversation would turn into an argument about tone instead of substance. I knew how that story ended. Explanation would not bring respect. It would only bring scrutiny. So I stayed quiet. Silence became a form of containment. I continued to do what needed to be done, but I stopped assuming I would do it forever. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to observe without reacting, to understand without fixing immediately. My mother sensed something, though she did not name it. She watched me more closely, asked questions framed as concern. She mentioned how lucky she was to have someone so capable. The compliments felt strategic, like reinforcement applied when pressure shifts. I accepted them with the same neutral nod I had learned to give to criticism. One evening, she brought up the folder again. She asked if I had finished reading it. Her voice was light, but her eyes were sharp. I told her I was still reviewing it, that I wanted to be sure I understood everything. She exhaled loudly and said I was making it bigger than it needed to be. She reminded me how much she had done for me, how she had opened her home, how family stepped up when needed. She said it was just a formality, nothing that would affect me long term. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said I was not comfortable signing something I did not fully understand. I said it calmly, without apology. The room felt colder after that. She did not raise her voice. She simply went quiet, the kind of quiet that signals displeasure more clearly than anger. That silence followed me into the next days. It hung in the air, unspoken but present. I felt it when I walked into the room, when I passed her in the hallway, when she asked for something and waited a beat longer than usual for my response. It was a test. She was measuring how much resistance she could apply before I yielded. What she did not know was that the resistance had already shifted direction. I was no longer pushing back. I was stepping away internally, inch by inch. I began noticing the points where access lived entirely with me. Passwords, contacts, information trails, things that had accumulated naturally as I handled more and more. There was no redundancy, no shared understanding. If I were gone, there was no map for anyone else to follow. That realization did not thrill me. It sobered me. The most dangerous kind of power is the kind no one realizes they have given away. Not because it invites abuse, but because it creates dependence without consent. I had become a safeguard without being asked if I wanted to be one. I still moved through the house quietly, still completed tasks, still answered questions. But something in my posture changed. I stopped offering extra explanations. I stopped filling in gaps before they were noticed. I allowed small delays to exist without rushing to erase them. It was not sabotage. It was restraint. My mother commented once that things felt slower lately. I shrugged and said I had been busy. She frowned, then smiled, then said she was sure I would catch up. Catch up. As if the pace were mine to correct. At night, in my room, I lay awake thinking about how easily the balance could tip, about how confident the house was in its own stability, about how that confidence rested on my continued compliance. I felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. Sadness for the relationship I thought I had. Resolve for the one I needed with myself. I did not yet know how I would step away or when. I only knew that explaining had reached its limit. Understanding had clarified something fundamental. I could not keep holding systems together for people who refused to see the cost. The quiet power I carried was never meant to be permanent. And once I understood that, the question was no longer whether things would change, but how quickly they would notice when they did. The decision did not arrive with a rush of anger or a dramatic moment of courage. It arrived quietly, the way clarity often does when it has been waiting its turn. That night, the house settled into sleep with its usual confidence, doors closing, lights dimming, the television murmuring and then going silent, as if tomorrow would unfold exactly like yesterday. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling and felt none of the familiar tightness in my chest. There was no rehearsed speech running through my head, no argument to win. I was done explaining. I understood then that confrontation would only hand control back to the people who thrived on it. Any attempt to defend myself would be reshaped into a story about tone, about gratitude, about my inability to take feedback. I had seen that pattern enough times to know how it ended. Silence was not avoidance anymore. It was discipline. It kept my center intact. I sat up and opened my laptop, not with urgency, but with intention. Preparation feels different when it is not fueled by fear. My movements were steady. I made a list, not of grievances, but of boundaries. What belonged to me. What I had been carrying for others. What could be released without ceremony. I did not need to plan everything at once. I only needed to take the first step. That step was administrative and small enough to be invisible. I logged into an account that had lived under my name because it had been easier that way at the time. Easier had become the most expensive word in that house. I changed a setting, turned off an automatic process, and saved the change. The confirmation sat on the screen like a quiet promise. Nothing exploded. No alarms sounded. The house slept on, unaware. I closed the laptop and let myself breathe. There was no thrill in it, no sense of revenge, only relief. Thin and unfamiliar, like air at a higher altitude. I knew what would follow eventually. I also knew I was not obligated to manage the timing of other people's realizations. In the days that followed, I moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of precision. I continued my routines. I went to work. I came home. I answered questions narrowly and completed what I had already committed to. I stopped offering extras. I stopped smoothing over small frictions before they were felt. When something took longer, I let it take longer. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. My mother noticed the change without naming it. She hovered more. She asked questions that sounded like concern but landed like inspection. She commented on how busy I seemed, how tired, how she worried I was doing too much. The irony was almost gentle. I nodded and said I was managing my time. One afternoon, she mentioned a deadline in passing and waited for me to respond. I did not. I continued washing a mug at the sink, the water running steady. After a moment, she repeated herself, adding my name. I turned and said I had not agreed to handle that one. The words felt solid in my mouth. Not sharp, not defensive, just factual. Her face tightened, then smoothed. She said she thought I always handled those things. I said that assumption was changing. The room went quiet, the way it does when someone realizes a lever has stopped working. She did not argue. She smiled and said we would figure it out. Figure it out sounded like an ending, but it was a beginning. That evening, I met an old colleague for coffee, someone who had known me before this chapter of my life, before my name had become shorthand for availability. We talked about work and weather and mutual acquaintances. At one point, she looked at me and said I seemed steadier, like I had made a decision. I laughed softly and said I had. She did not ask what it was. She did not need to. Being seen that way reminded me how different respect feels from dependence. Back at the house, the air felt thicker. My mother spoke more carefully, choosing her words as if she were navigating around something fragile. She praised me again, more deliberately this time, pointing out how capable I was, how much she trusted me. I accepted the praise without absorbing it. Compliments offered to restore control are still tools. I spent that night sorting through documents, not to fix anything, but to understand where the threads ran. I traced how access had accumulated, how knowledge had pooled with me simply because I paid attention. There was no backup plan, no shared understanding. The house rested on a single assumption that I would always step in. Once I saw it clearly, the structure looked less impressive, more precarious. I resisted the urge to warn anyone. Warning would have been a gift, a chance to adjust without discomfort. The truth was that warnings had been given before, quietly, through fatigue, through questions, through hesitation. They had been ignored because ignoring them was easier. I did not owe anyone a rehearsal for consequences. The first message arrived 2 days later, light in tone, asking if I could check on something when I had a moment. I saw it on my phone while I was standing in line at the pharmacy. I did not reply, not because I was angry, but because the question assumed a role I had already stepped out of. Silence answered it more honestly than words. More messages followed, still casual, still framed as reminders rather than requests. I read them and set the phone down. Each time I felt the familiar pull to respond, to fix, to reassure. Each time I let the feeling pass. Boundaries are muscles. They strengthen with use. At home that night, my mother mentioned that something felt off, that a process seemed slower than usual. She asked if I had noticed. I said I had been focused on my own work. She nodded, then frowned, then changed the subject. The house was beginning to sense the absence of a safety net without knowing where it had gone. I did not feel triumphant. I felt sober. Preparation carries a cost. It means accepting that people will be confused, that they may feel abandoned, that they will tell stories about your motives that make them more comfortable. I accepted that cost because the alternative was erasure. I packed a small bag that night, not to leave yet, but to be ready. Practical things, documents, a few clothes, items that mattered to me. The act of packing felt ceremonial, even though no one else would see it. It marked a line inside me. I was no longer waiting to be released. The house slept again, confident in its routines. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the settling of wood. I thought about how long I had absorbed impact so others would not have to. How loyalty had been confused with endurance. How often being needed had been mistaken for being valued. I did not plan revenge. I planned distance. I planned a life where my energy belonged to me. The difference mattered. When I finally slept, it was deep and untroubled. In the morning, the house would begin to notice small changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing they could point to. Just enough to unsettle the assumption that everything would always be handled. I did not know how quickly the unraveling would start, only that it would. And for the first time, that knowledge did not scare me. The first sign came on a morning that felt almost ordinary, the kind of day that usually passed without leaving a mark. I woke before my alarm, made coffee, and sat at the small table by the window, watching the street wake up. The quiet felt earned. I checked my phone out of habit, then set it face down again. I had learned that the absence of noise could mean more than the noise itself. At work, the hours moved quickly. I focused on tasks that belonged to me and only me. There was a calm in that, a steadiness I had not felt in months. During my lunch break, my phone vibrated once. I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name. The preview showed a short message asking if I had noticed something strange with a process she assumed I monitored. The wording was casual, almost friendly, as if nothing had changed. I did not answer. I finished my lunch, washed my hands, and went back to work. By the time I got home that evening, the house sounded different. Not louder, just unsettled. Cabinets closed a little harder. Footsteps moved with purpose instead of ease. My mother stood at the counter, her shoulders tense, tapping her fingers as if waiting for something to resolve itself. She asked if I had a minute. I said I was heading to my room to change. She followed me halfway down the hall and mentioned that something had not gone through the way it usually did. Her tone suggested annoyance more than concern. I nodded and said I had not looked at it. She frowned and said she thought I always kept an eye on those things. I said that had changed. The words landed softly and stayed there. She did not argue. She exhaled and said she would look into it. The sentence sounded confident, but her eyes flicked away. I closed my door and sat on the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing. I felt no rush to intervene. The system needed to show itself. The next day, the issue did not resolve. It grew a little, the way unresolved things do when no one knows where to apply pressure. My mother made a call and ended it abruptly, irritation sharp in her voice. Later, she mentioned that someone had given her a runaround. She said she hated dealing with these people. I said nothing. I folded laundry and put it away. By the third day, the assumption that everything would right itself had started to fray. I heard her on the phone again, her voice tighter now, repeating details she had never needed to remember before. She paced the living room, stopping occasionally to look at the calendar on the fridge, as if the dates might rearrange themselves. When she hung up, she asked me what she should say next time. I told her she should ask them to explain the requirements clearly. She asked if I could do it for her. I said I could not. That was when the irritation turned into concern. Not fear yet, just the uncomfortable awareness that something was outside her control. She went quiet after that, retreating into herself the way she did when she did not want to admit confusion. The house carried the tension like humidity. I learned about the next problem indirectly. A message from a family member asking if everything was all right. The wording was careful, curious without being accusatory. I replied that I was fine. They asked about the house. I said I did not live there anymore. The pause on the other end felt long even through text. The issues began to stack. One delay exposed another. A missed step made a follow-up necessary. Each fix required knowledge that had never been shared. My mother tried to manage it the way she managed everything else, with confidence and impatience, assuming authority would smooth the process. It did not. Authority without understanding is brittle. Her calls grew more frequent. Not to me at first, but to others she thought might fill the gap. I heard her leave messages, explaining and re-explaining, her tone shifting from composed to clipped. She mentioned my name once in a way that suggested continuity, as if I were still part of the solution. The person on the other end must have said something she did not like, because she ended the call abruptly and stared at the wall for a long moment afterward. By the end of the week, the household routine had changed. Meals were later. Plans were tentative. Conversations circled the same problem without naming it. I moved through the space quietly, aware of the disturbance my absence created even while I was still physically there. It was a strange position, to be both present and removed. The first direct attempt to pull me back came that Saturday morning, a text that said we need to talk, followed by another that said this cannot wait. The urgency was new. So was the lack of accusation. I took a breath and did not respond. I left the house and went for a walk, the autumn air crisp against my face. Distance makes it easier to hold a line. When I returned, my mother was in the living room with papers spread across the coffee table. She looked up as I came in, relief and frustration tangled together. She said she needed help understanding something and that this was getting serious. I told her she should contact the appropriate office and ask for guidance. She asked me to sit down. I said I was heading out again. The look she gave me then was not anger. It was disbelief. She followed me to the door and said I could not just step away like this. I turned and said I had stepped away already. The sentence sounded final even to me. She stood there, hands at her sides, as if she were waiting for the world to correct me. It did not. The external pressure arrived soon after. A letter in the mail addressed to the house, official and impersonal. My mother read it at the kitchen table, her face draining of color. She called someone immediately and was told what she did not want to hear. The process had moved forward without the adjustments that usually kept it smooth. The timeline was no longer flexible. That evening, she called me into the kitchen and held the letter out as if it were evidence of my negligence. She said this was my responsibility. I looked at the letter and then at her. I said it was not. The air between us went still. She accused me of being difficult. I said I was being accurate. Accuracy has a way of ending arguments without resolving feelings. The blame began to circulate. I heard my name used in conversations where it had not appeared before. Someone said they assumed I was handling things. Someone else said I must have forgotten. The story shifted quickly, away from the system that had depended on me and toward the idea that I had abandoned it. That story was easier for them. It placed the discomfort somewhere else. Messages started arriving on my phone again, this time from different directions. A relative asking if I could jump on a call. A family friend asking if I knew what was going on. The tone was no longer casual. It was edged with concern, with the kind of politeness people use when they are afraid of overstepping but need something badly. I did not respond. I put the phone in my bag and went about my day. Watching the unraveling was not satisfying. It was sobering. I had underestimated how quickly stability had been borrowed, not built. The house had relied on continuity without understanding the source. Once that continuity paused, the structure showed its seams. My mother tried to reassert control through volume and confidence. She spoke louder on the phone, emphasized her position, her years of involvement, her right to be informed. It worked briefly, until questions were asked she could not answer. Each call ended with more instructions, more requirements, more things to follow up on. The list grew faster than she could manage. One evening, she knocked on my door and asked if I would help just this once. The phrase was familiar. It had always meant this will become yours again. I told her I could not. She asked why I was doing this to her. I told her I was not doing anything. I was simply not preventing what had already been set in motion. She stared at me as if I had spoken a different language. The realization came to her in stages. First confusion, then irritation, then a brittle calm that signaled fear. She began to understand that the problem was not a single issue, but a chain. That the chain had been held together by someone who was no longer willing to grip it. The house felt smaller as the days passed. Conversations grew short. Doors closed more often. The sense of inevitability settled in. I kept my routines. I went to work. I came home. I prepared quietly for my own next steps, organizing documents, confirming arrangements I had made earlier. I did not announce any of it. By the end of the week, the family discovered a detail that changed everything. A point of access they did not have. Information they could not retrieve without me. The panic that followed was immediate and unmistakable. Voices rose. Calls were made. Plans were abandoned. The assumption that someone else would step in finally cracked. I stood in my room that night, packing a few things into a bag, listening to the sounds of a system struggling without its silent support. I felt a mix of sadness and resolve. Sadness for what had been lost, resolve for what I would not carry back inside. They had not lost control all at once. They had lost the person who had been holding it quietly together. And once that truth settled, there would be no pretending otherwise. The knock came the next morning, firm and deliberate, the kind that assumes you will answer because you always have. I was standing in my small kitchen holding a mug of coffee, the window cracked open to let in the cold air, when the sound traveled straight through my chest and settled there. I did not jump. I did not rush. I took a slow breath, set the mug down, and counted to 5 before I moved. I knew who it was before I reached the door. Not my mother. She would have called first, or sent a message that sounded like a command wrapped in concern. This was someone else. Someone who believed proximity still meant access. Someone who thought the situation could be corrected by showing up. When I opened the door, my stepfather stood there, coat buttoned, jaw set, eyes already scanning past me into the apartment as if he were assessing a problem he expected me to solve. He did not smile. He did not ask how I was. He stepped forward a half step, testing the boundary before I had even decided whether to let him cross it. He said we needed to talk. He said things had gotten complicated. He said there were issues that required my attention. I did not move aside. I told him this was not a good time. The words surprised him. I could see it in the way his eyebrows lifted slightly, the way his weight shifted. He had not come prepared for resistance. He had come expecting continuity. He said it would only take a minute and stepped forward again. I held my ground. I said whatever it was could be handled without me. He exhaled sharply, irritation slipping through his control, and asked if he could at least come in. I said no. The hallway felt narrow with him standing there, his presence filling the space with urgency that did not belong to me. He asked what I thought I was doing. He said the house was in trouble. He said people were asking questions. He said this was not the time to make a point. I told him I was not making a point. I was living my life. He looked at me like I had missed something obvious. He said this was not about me. He said this was about responsibilities. He said I could not just walk away and leave things unfinished. The word unfinished landed like an accusation. I asked him to be specific. I asked him to tell me exactly what he needed from me. The pause that followed was telling. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. His words less confident this time. He mentioned a process that was stalled. He mentioned information they could not access. He mentioned deadlines that were approaching fast. As he spoke, I saw the shape of his panic take form. This was not about fixing a single problem. It was about regaining a position they had assumed was permanent. He was here because they had reached the edge of what they could pretend to manage. I told him I was no longer involved. I said it calmly, without explanation. His eyes narrowed. He asked since when. I said since I moved out. He said that was not how it worked. I said it was how it was working now. He raised his voice then, just slightly, enough to signal frustration without tipping into something he could be blamed for. He said my mother was under a lot of stress. He said this was not fair. He said family did not do this to each other. I listened without interrupting. I had heard these arguments before, always deployed when access was threatened. When he finished, I said I was not responsible for managing their stress. I said I had been clear about stepping away. I said I was not available. The word available hung between us, heavy with meaning. He stared at me, then laughed once, short and humorless, and said I was being dramatic. He said I always did this when things got uncomfortable. He said I was overreacting to one comment. I felt a familiar tug then, the old instinct to defend myself, to explain how long this had been building, how many small moments had led here. I let it pass. Explanation would have given him ground to stand on. Silence kept me upright. He tried a different approach. He said they needed something specific, just one thing. He said if I could provide it, everything else could be sorted out. He asked for access to information I knew he did not understand. He said it like a request, but his eyes said demand. I told him I would not provide it. I did not say why. I did not say what it was worth. I simply said no. The effect was immediate. His confidence faltered. He asked if I understood the consequences. He said this could get messy. He said there were implications beyond the house. I said I understood. He asked if I was trying to hurt them. I said I was not trying to do anything. I was choosing not to intervene. That distinction seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. He was used to conflict. He was not used to refusal without emotion. He asked if this was some kind of revenge. I said it was a boundary. He stepped back then, finally registering that the door had not opened wider at any point in the conversation. He looked past me again, as if the apartment itself were evidence of betrayal. He said I was making a mistake. He said I would regret this. He said people would not forget. I told him I was comfortable with that. The silence stretched. I could hear someone moving in the apartment next door, the everyday sounds of life continuing without regard for the drama unfolding in the hallway. He seemed to notice it too, his gaze flicking away as if reminded that this was not a stage he controlled. He said one last thing before turning to leave. He said they would figure it out without me, but it would not be pretty. The words were meant to sound like a warning. They sounded like confirmation. He walked away without another look, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it for a moment, not because I was shaken, but because the encounter had clarified something important. They were not coming to ask how I was. They were coming to retrieve what they believed belonged to them. I returned to the kitchen and picked up my coffee, now lukewarm. My hands were steady. The adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by a quiet certainty. That knock had been inevitable. It marked the moment when distance became undeniable. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from my mother, longer than the others, careful in tone. She said she was worried. She said things were spiraling. She said she did not understand why I was shutting them out. She said we needed to talk as a family. I read it once and set the phone down. I did not reply. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I went to work. I answered emails. I moved through familiar tasks with a clarity that felt almost clinical. The confrontation replayed in my mind, not as a source of anxiety, but as data. It confirmed what I had already suspected. Their concern was logistical, not relational. They wanted access, not understanding. By evening, the pressure increased. Another message, then a call I did not answer. Then a voicemail, his voice this time, more urgent, less controlled. He said things were worse than expected. He said they needed help immediately. He said this was getting serious. I listened to the voicemail without reacting. I noticed how quickly the language had shifted from obligation to desperation. That shift told me everything I needed to know about the balance of power. I sat at my small table that night, paperwork spread out in front of me, confirming arrangements I had already made. My life felt contained, manageable, mine. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the drama that had once defined my days. The knock had changed something fundamental. It had taken the conflict out of abstraction and placed it in my doorway. It had shown me how far they were willing to go to avoid accountability. And it had shown them that I was no longer standing in the role they had assigned me. I knew this would not be the last attempt. There would be more messages, more pressure, more stories told about my motives. That was fine. The line had been drawn, not in anger, but in fact. As I gathered the papers and turned off the light, I felt the weight of what was coming next. The consequences would not stay contained much longer. They would spread, touch other people, attract attention that could not be managed with a raised voice or a practiced smile. And for the first time, I was not bracing myself to catch the fallout. I was standing still, letting it move where it belonged, knowing that what followed this knock would reach far beyond my door. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through ordinary channels, mail slots, phone notifications, side conversations that reached me through people who did not realize they were carrying messages. I noticed it first in the way my name started appearing in places it had never needed to before. A forwarded email asking if I could clarify something, a voicemail from an unfamiliar number mentioning the house and assuming I was still the point of contact. The structure they had relied on was visible now because it was breaking. I let the messages accumulate without responding, not out of spite, but because each one revealed how deeply my role had been misunderstood. They were not asking me how I was. They were asking me to resume a function. That distinction mattered more than any apology they might have offered. At work, I stayed focused. I volunteered for an extra shift, not because I needed the money, but because the rhythm grounded me. There is something clarifying about environments where responsibility is explicit, where roles are named and boundaries are respected. When a shift ends, it ends. No one expects you to carry the building home with you. During a break, I checked my phone and saw a message from a family friend, someone my mother trusted, someone she often leaned on when things became complicated. The message was polite and carefully worded. It said there seemed to be some confusion and asked if I could help clear it up. The implication was gentle but firm. I typed a response and erased it twice before settling on a simple sentence saying I was no longer involved and they would need to speak directly with my mother. I sent it and felt a small release in my chest. The reply came quickly, surprised but courteous. They said they had not realized I had stepped away. They said they hoped everything was all right. I did not answer. The truth was more than they needed, and less than they could use. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. I watched it vibrate on the counter until it stopped. A moment later, a text appeared, longer than the others, careful in tone, almost reflective. She said she was overwhelmed. She said she did not understand why this was happening all at once. She said she wished I would just talk to her. The message ended with a line about family sticking together. I sat at the table and read it twice. I noticed what was missing. No acknowledgement of the work I had done, no recognition of how long I had carried it, no curiosity about why I needed distance. The message framed the situation as confusion, not consequence. I set the phone down without replying. The consequences grew louder after that. A letter arrived at my apartment addressed to me, forwarded from the house, official in appearance and urgent in tone. It referenced a lapse that could no longer be smoothed over. The language was precise, the deadlines firm. I read it carefully and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the kind of moment I had spent years preventing. Now it was happening without me. I called the number listed on the letter, not to fix anything, but to clarify my position. I explained that I no longer lived at the address in question and was not responsible for the matter. The person on the other end asked a few questions, clearly surprised. They asked how long that had been the case. I gave the date. There was a pause, then a change in tone. They thanked me for the information and said they would update their records. When I hung up, I felt the final thread loosen. On paper, as well as in practice, I was no longer attached. The reaction at the house was immediate. I learned about it through a flurry of messages that night, my phone lighting up with names I recognized and some I did not. The tone had shifted again, away from assumption and toward alarm. People were asking what had happened. They were asking who was responsible. They were asking how this could have been missed. My mother left a voicemail, her voice tight, asking if I knew about the letter. She said this was serious. She said this was not something that could be ignored. She said we needed to talk now. I listened to the message once and deleted it. The next day, a relative showed up at my apartment. Someone older. Someone who had always played the role of mediator. They knocked gently, waited, knocked again. I opened the door and saw concern written across their face, genuine this time, not strategic. They asked if they could come in. I hesitated, then stepped aside. We sat at my small table, the same one where I had sorted my own documents weeks earlier. They looked around, taking in the modest space, the quiet order of it. They said they had not realized I had moved out. I said I had. They spoke carefully, choosing words meant to soothe. They said my mother was struggling. They said the situation had escalated quickly. They said everyone was surprised. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting the information settle without absorbing the responsibility attached to it. When they finished, I told them the truth, calmly and without embellishment. I said I had been managing things for a long time. I said I had stepped away deliberately. I said the consequences they were seeing were the result of systems that had depended on me without acknowledgement or backup. I said I was not returning to that role. They looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. They said they wished they had known how much I had been carrying. They said my mother had always made it sound effortless. The word effortless made me smile, not kindly. Effortless is what people call labor they do not see. They asked if there was anything I could do to help smooth things over. I said there was not. I said helping now would only reinforce the belief that I would always step in when things got uncomfortable. I said the house needed to adjust without me. They nodded slowly, as if understanding something new. When they left, they did not promise to fix anything. They simply said they hoped things would settle. I closed the door and felt lighter than I had in days. The adjustment was not graceful. The house lurched from one solution to another, trying to patch gaps without addressing the foundation. My mother called offices she had never spoken to before. She asked questions she did not like the answers to. She tried to assign tasks to people who did not know how to handle them. Each attempt revealed another layer of dependence that had gone unexamined. I heard about it through fragments. A cousin mentioned the tension. A friend asked if I was okay. Someone said my mother was angry, then embarrassed, then angry again. The stories varied, but the theme was consistent. The absence of my quiet labor had become visible, and visibility was uncomfortable. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized from the letter. I answered this time. The person on the line asked to confirm details and inform me that further action would proceed based on the updated records. They said notices would be sent directly to the address in question. They thanked me for clarifying earlier. The call was brief and professional. When it ended, there was no doubt left about where responsibility lay. That evening, my mother sent another message, shorter than the others. She said she did not understand how I could let things get this far. The phrasing struck me. Let things get this far. As if I had been the one driving the process. As if my stepping away were an act of negligence rather than self-preservation. I did not respond. I was done correcting narratives that required my silence to survive. The house faced its reckoning in stages. First denial, then scrambling, then the slow acceptance that nothing would revert to how it had been. People adjusted their expectations. New routines formed, awkward and imperfect. Tasks were redistributed, reluctantly at first, then with necessity. From a distance, it looked less like collapse and more like exposure. The structure had never been as stable as it appeared. It had been propped up by a single, unacknowledged source. Once that source withdrew, reality rushed in. I focused on my own life. I set up my accounts, arranged my schedule, built routines that served me instead of consuming me. The quiet of my apartment became familiar, comforting. Each decision I made belonged to me alone. There were moments when guilt surfaced, sharp and sudden. A memory of my mother at the table, her voice edged with frustration. A reminder of how easily concern can blur into obligation. I let the guilt pass, feeling it did not mean I had to obey it. The escalation reached its peak when a final notice arrived at the house, one that could not be ignored or redirected. I did not see it, but I heard about it within hours. The panic it triggered spread quickly. Calls were made. Voices were raised. Plans were changed abruptly. That night, my phone buzzed repeatedly, then went silent. I sat on my couch, lights low, listening to the hum of the city outside. I felt the weight of the moment without flinching. This was the point of no return, not because something terrible had happened, but because the illusion had fully dissolved. They were facing the consequences of a system built on assumption. I was facing the beginning of a life built on choice. The difference was stark, and it was real. As I turned off my phone and let the silence settle, I knew the next chapter would not be about scrambling or blame. It would be about aftermath, about how people adapt when they can no longer rely on what they once took for granted. And it would test whether distance could finally turn into something resembling understanding, or whether it would harden into something else entirely. The days that followed felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. I woke each morning expecting a new message, a new demand, some fresh attempt to pull me back into a story that was no longer mine. Instead, there was a strange lull, the kind that comes after a storm when the damage has already been done and everyone is quietly taking stock. I learned what had happened not from my mother, but from a cousin who called late one afternoon, her voice lowered as if we were sharing something fragile. She said the house was being emptied. Not sold exactly, not yet, but stripped down to what could be moved quickly. Boxes everywhere, furniture tagged. The tone she used suggested shock more than sympathy. Things had unraveled faster than anyone expected. She told me my mother had tried to negotiate, to buy time, to convince people that the situation was temporary. But temporary had run out. The system did not care how convincing she sounded. It only cared about what was documented and what was not. My name no longer appeared where it once had. Without it, there was nothing to lean on. When I hung up, I sat in my apartment and let the information settle. I did not feel triumph. I felt a quiet sadness, the kind that comes when something ends not with understanding, but with necessity. There is no ceremony for that kind of ending. It just happens. A few days later, my mother finally called. Not a message this time. A call. I stared at the phone as it rang, the familiar vibration echoing in the room. I answered on the third ring, not because I was ready, but because avoidance would no longer serve either of us. Her voice sounded smaller, not weak, but compressed, as if she were holding herself tightly together. She said my name once and paused. I waited. She said they were moving. She said it was not what she had planned. She said things had gotten out of hand. I listened without interrupting. I had learned the value of silence. She said she wished I had told her how serious things were. I said I had. She said she did not realize it would lead to this. I said I did not either, but that did not change what had happened. The truth hung between us, bare and uncomfortable. She asked if I felt satisfied. The question surprised me. I told her no. I told her satisfaction had never been the point. I told her I had stepped away because I could not keep carrying everything without being seen. I told her I had needed to protect myself. There was a long pause. Then she said she had never thought of it that way. The sentence was soft, almost fragile. I did not rush to fill the silence. Understanding, if it came, would need space. She said she was tired. She said she felt foolish. She said she did not know how things had slipped so far without her noticing. I told her that sometimes systems work precisely because one person absorbs the strain quietly. When that person stops, the strain becomes visible. I did not say my name. I did not need to. She asked where I was living now. I told her. She asked if I was doing all right. The question sounded genuine, not strategic. I said I was. It was the truth. We did not resolve anything in that conversation, There were no apologies, no dramatic admissions, no promises of change. But something shifted. The call ended without anger, without accusation, just fatigue on both sides. After that, the stories reached me in pieces. My mother and her husband moved into a smaller place on the edge of town, one they could manage without outside support. It was not what she had envisioned for herself. The house she had once curated so carefully was gone, replaced by something practical and bare. People adjusted their expectations. Visits became less frequent. The noise around her life quieted. I saw her once during that period, by chance, at a grocery store. We stood a few feet apart, carts between us like neutral ground. She looked older, not in years, but in posture, less performative. We exchanged polite words. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. She nodded. There was no hostility, just distance. That distance allowed me to build something of my own without interference. My days found a rhythm. Work, rest, small pleasures I had once postponed indefinitely. I cooked for myself. I chose what to watch. I left things undone without guilt. Each choice felt like a quiet reclaiming. There were moments when the old reflex returned, the urge to check on others, to anticipate problems, to offer solutions. I noticed it and let it pass. Habits formed over years do not disappear overnight. They loosen slowly, replaced by something sturdier. The family narrative shifted as well. Where I had once been described as unsettled, I was now referred to as independent. The word carried different weight depending on who used it. Some said it with respect. Others said it like a warning. I did not correct them. Labels lose their power when you stop answering to them. One evening, a letter arrived at my apartment, forwarded from the old address, addressed to my mother but marked confidential. She must have used my name as a forwarding contact without thinking. I did not open it. I wrote return to sender on the envelope and dropped it back in the mail. The act felt symbolic, a final confirmation that I was no longer the bridge. I thought often about the word she had used at the table, the one that had ignited everything. It lingered in my mind longer than I liked. Leech. It was an ugly word, heavy with accusation. For a while, I turned it over, trying to understand how it had taken root. How someone could rely so completely on another person and still believe that person was taking too much. Eventually, the word lost its grip. It did not match the reality of my life. It belonged to a story built to justify imbalance. Once that story collapsed, the word became meaningless. I began to see how easily families confuse familiarity with entitlement. How roles harden over time until they no longer serve the people inside them. How quickly gratitude erodes when labor is invisible. None of this was unique to my family. That realization brought a strange comfort. I was not a failure. I was a pattern breaker. A month after the move, my mother sent a short message. She said she hoped I was well. She said the new place was smaller, but manageable. She said she was learning things she should have known earlier. There was no request in the message, no implied task, just information. I replied with a simple sentence wishing her well. It felt sufficient. I noticed then how much energy I had regained. Evenings stretched instead of collapsing into exhaustion. Mornings began without dread. The constant vigilance that had once defined my days faded into the background. I felt present in my own life again. There were still moments of grief, not for the house or the role I had left, but for the relationship I had hoped for and never quite had. Grief does not always mean wanting something back. Sometimes it means accepting that it never existed in the way you needed. As winter approached, the city shifted into its quieter rhythm. I watched the lights come on earlier each day, the streets softening under cold air. I felt grounded, not triumphant, not bitter, just steady. The aftermath had not brought closure in the dramatic sense. There were no final confrontations, no public reckonings. But there was clarity. The kind that settles in after the noise fades, when everyone is forced to live with what remains. I had stepped away from a system that consumed me and left little behind. In its place, I was building something simpler and stronger. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. The story was no longer about what they lost when I left. It was about what I gained when I stayed gone. And as I stood in my apartment one quiet evening, looking out at the city lights, I knew the next part of my life would be defined not by reaction, but by choice. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was structured, like a room after furniture has been rearranged with intention. I moved through my days without checking my phone every few minutes, without scanning for problems that did not belong to me. That absence of vigilance created space, and into that space came reflection I had postponed for years. I started noticing how much of my identity had been built around usefulness, how often I had measured my worth by how smoothly other people's lives ran. It was uncomfortable to admit how deeply that belief had settled in me, long before I moved back into my mother's house. I had learned early that praise came most reliably when I was solving something. Being capable had become a kind of armor, one I wore so long I forgot it was optional. Without the constant demand, the armor felt heavy. I set it down slowly. I let myself be inefficient in small ways. I left dishes in the sink overnight. I said no to extra shifts even when the money would have been helpful. I allowed boredom to exist without immediately filling it. Each small act felt like rebellion against an old rule that said stillness was indulgence. People around me noticed the change. A coworker asked if I was taking time off. A neighbor commented that I seemed more relaxed. I smiled and said I had simplified things. That word felt right. Simplification is not loss, it is selection. One afternoon, while sorting through a box I had packed in a hurry weeks earlier, I found a stack of old papers. Notes I had taken for other people. Lists that were not mine. Reminders written in my handwriting but addressed to no one. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one, feeling a strange mix of grief and relief. These were artifacts of a life spent maintaining structures that did not sustain me. I shredded most of them. The sound of paper tearing was oddly satisfying. It felt like an ending that did not need an audience. That evening, my mother sent another message. Not a request. Not an update. Just a sentence saying she had been thinking about what I said during our last call. She said she had not realized how much I had relied on myself to keep things running. The phrasing was awkward, as if she were translating a new language. I read it carefully, then responded with a simple acknowledgement. I did not push for more. Insight, if it came, would need to be her own. I understood then that forgiveness did not require proximity. It did not require reconciliation in the way people imagine it. Forgiveness could be internal, a decision not to carry bitterness forward. It did not mean reopening doors that had been closed for good reason. I began making plans that did not account for anyone else's approval. Small ones at first. A weekend trip I had postponed for years. A class I signed up for because it interested me, not because it was practical. I filled my calendar with things that belonged to me. The freedom felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, but also right. There were moments when the old narrative tried to reassert itself. When I caught myself wondering if I should check in, offer help, smooth things over. Each time, I asked myself a simple question. Would this come from choice or from fear? If the answer was fear, I let it go. The family adjusted in their own ways. Some relationships grew quieter, others shifted tone. A few people reached out to say they had not known how much I had done. Their surprise was genuine, their regret, real. I accepted their words without letting them pull me back into old roles. Recognition after the fact does not undo damage, but it can mark a turning point. I also learned to recognize the difference between being needed and being wanted. Being needed creates pressure. Being wanted creates connection. For years, I had confused the two. Now the distinction felt clear. One afternoon, I ran into my stepfather at a hardware store. The encounter was brief and awkward. He nodded. I nodded back. There was no conversation, no confrontation. Just two people acknowledging a changed reality. He looked tired, older. I felt no urge to bridge the gap. That encounter confirmed something I had been circling for weeks. Closure does not always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from seeing the other person clearly without the need to engage. I spent more time alone without feeling lonely. I read. I walked. I sat with my thoughts and let them move at their own pace. The absence of constant problem solving allowed a different kind of awareness to surface. I began to notice what I enjoyed, not what I was good at. The difference mattered. As the year turned, I took stock of what had changed. My finances were simpler. My responsibilities were contained. My emotional landscape was quieter. I no longer woke up bracing for impact. I woke up curious about the day. The word that had haunted me for months lost its sting completely. It became a reminder, not of shame, but of clarity. Labels are powerful only when we accept them. Once I rejected the role they were designed to enforce, the label dissolved. I thought about how many people live inside roles they did not choose, how often they confuse endurance with virtue. I wished I could tell them what I had learned without preaching, that stepping away is not abandonment, that boundaries are not punishments, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to continue a pattern that harms you. I did not know what my relationship with my mother would look like in the long term. I knew only that it would have limits, and that those limits were necessary. Whatever grew within them would be more honest than what had existed before. One evening, as I turned off the lights in my apartment and prepared for bed, I felt a sense of completion I had not expected. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer waiting for resolution to begin living. The transformation was not dramatic. It did not come with applause or vindication. It came quietly, through consistency, through choices repeated until they formed a new shape. A life no longer organized around proving my worth. I lay down and listened to the city settle for the night. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional voice drifting up from the street, ordinary sounds, grounding and real. I felt present in a way I had not for a long time. What had begun as an accusation had ended as an education, not just for my family, but for me. I had learned where my responsibility ended and my life began. And that knowledge, once claimed, could not be taken back. As sleep came, I knew the next chapter would not be about conflict or fallout. It would be about continuation, about carrying this clarity forward without apology, about building a future that did not require my silence to function. Life did not return to normal after everything settled. It found a different rhythm, one that required less vigilance and more intention. I noticed it first in small moments, the kind that used to slip past me unnoticed. Making breakfast without checking my phone. Letting a call go to voicemail without feeling a spike of anxiety. Sitting with a cup of tea in the late afternoon and realizing there was nowhere else I needed to be. That steadiness carried into my relationships. Friends spoke to me differently now, not because they knew the full story, but because I was no longer presenting myself as perpetually available. When I said no, it landed without explanation. When I said yes, it came without resentment. The balance felt new, fragile at first, then gradually more solid. I thought often about how close I had come to staying silent forever. How easy it would have been to absorb one more comment, one more dismissal, One more assumption that my role was fixed. I had lived that way for so long that leaving it behind felt almost unreal, yet each day reinforced the truth. I was not losing myself anymore. I was finding myself in the quiet spaces where I used to be busy fixing. My mother and I spoke occasionally, cautiously. The conversations were shorter, less loaded. She told me about her days in the new place, about learning to manage things she once delegated without thought. She complained less. When she did complain, she owned it as frustration, not as an invitation for me to solve it. I listened, offered empathy, and stopped there. One evening, she admitted something she had never said out loud before. She said she had relied on me because I made it easy. She said she told herself that meant I did not mind. The admission was clumsy, imperfect, but it was real. I felt a familiar ache rise in my chest and let it settle without trying to shape it into forgiveness or anger. Understanding did not erase the past, but it softened the edges. I told her I had minded. I said it calmly, without accusation. I said I had not known how to say it before because I did not want to be seen as ungrateful. There was a pause on the line, then a quiet acknowledgement. No defense, no redirection, just space. That was enough. After that, our contact found a new boundary. We spoke as adults, not as roles. When the conversation drifted toward old patterns, I redirected it gently or ended it. She adjusted. Slowly, imperfectly, but she adjusted. The rest of the family followed suit. Invitations came with clearer expectations. Requests came framed as requests, not assumptions. Some people pulled away, uncomfortable with the shift. Others leaned in, curious about who I was without the constant labor attached. I let those dynamics play out without trying to manage them. I found myself thinking less about what I owed and more about what I wanted to build. The future felt open in a way it never had before. Not because everything was certain, but because the uncertainty belonged to me. I made plans that extended beyond immediate needs. I considered changes that had once felt impossible. A different role at work. A move to a place that suited me better. Ideas that had lived quietly in the background began to step forward. There were days when the old guilt returned, sharp and sudden. A memory of my mother struggling. A thought about how things might have been easier if I had stayed. I learned to sit with that feeling without acting on it. Guilt is not always a signal to fix something. Sometimes it is simply the echo of an old habit losing its hold. I wrote down what I had learned, not as a list of lessons, but as reminders to myself. That being responsible does not mean being responsible for everything. That love does not require self-erasure. That boundaries do not destroy relationships. They reveal which ones are real. One afternoon, while walking through my neighborhood, I passed a house with its front door open, voices spilling out, the sound of a family arguing lightly about dinner plans. It struck me how ordinary it looked, how normal the tension felt. Not every raised voice is harm. Not every disagreement signals imbalance. The difference lies in whether everyone is allowed to exist fully inside it. I realized then that what I had wanted all along was not control or validation. It was mutuality, a sense that effort flowed in more than one direction. That recognition, once named, felt obvious. How I had missed it for so long amazed me. As months passed, the story of what happened faded into the background. It became something people referenced less often, something that no longer defined me. I did not need to retell it. I carried it as context, not as identity. My life grew quieter in ways that felt nourishing. I spent evenings reading or cooking simple meals. I invited friends over without worrying about the state of the house. I traveled lightly, choosing places that felt restorative instead of impressive. Each choice reinforced the same truth. I was no longer living in reaction. There was one final conversation that marked the end of that chapter for me. My mother called to say she was sorting through old photos and came across pictures from when I was younger. She said she had forgotten how serious I looked even then. She wondered aloud when that seriousness had begun. I told her I thought it started when I learned that being helpful was safer than being honest. She did not argue. She said she was sorry she had not seen it sooner. The apology was simple, unadorned. I accepted it without conditions. It did not erase the past, but it acknowledged it. That mattered. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, letting the moment settle. Closure does not always come with a dramatic ending. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a sentence spoken without defense. I knew then that I was ready to move forward without looking back. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because I no longer needed resolution to justify my choices. The story had reached its natural end. I closed my notebook, turned off the light, and felt a sense of readiness for what came next. The final chapter would not be about conflict or survival. It would be about carrying this clarity into the world, about choosing myself without apology, about living in a way that did not require me to disappear for others to feel comfortable. And for the first time, that felt not just possible, but natural. The evening light settled across my apartment in long, quiet lines, and for once I did not feel the need to move through it quickly. I let the day end at its own pace. I cooked a simple dinner, washed the dishes, and sat at the table long after the food was gone, listening to the hum of the building, the distant sounds of other lives unfolding without intersecting with mine. This was the life I had chosen. Not perfect, not dramatic, but mine. For a long time, I believed my value lived in how much I could absorb, how much pressure I could carry without letting it show. I was praised for being strong, for being reliable, for being the one who never made things harder. What no one ever asked was what that strength cost me, or who I was when I was not holding everything together. I did not know how to answer that question myself until I stopped doing it. When I think back to the moment that changed everything, I realize now it was never about the insult itself. It was about the certainty behind it, the ease with which my effort was erased and replaced with a label. That certainty forced me to confront something I had avoided for years. I was living inside a role that required my silence to function. And the moment I spoke, or stepped away, the entire structure protested. Leaving was not impulsive. It was the result of a truth that had been building quietly inside me. I did not leave to make a statement. I left because I understood that staying would mean accepting a version of myself that no longer felt true. Sometimes self-respect arrives not as confidence, but as refusal. The days after I left were disorienting. I had to relearn how to exist without anticipating everyone else's needs. I had to remind myself that rest did not need to be justified, that stillness was not laziness, that my time belonged to me. That adjustment took longer than I expected. Patterns shaped over years do not dissolve overnight, but slowly, consistently, they loosened their grip. My relationship with my mother now exists on honest ground, not comfortable, not sentimental, but real. She has had to face things she once passed along to me without thought. I have had to accept that I cannot shield her from every consequence. We speak without pretending. Sometimes that is all a relationship can be, and sometimes it is enough. What surprised me most was how my own voice returned once the noise faded. I started to notice what I liked, not just what I was good at. I made decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. I allowed myself to disappoint people without collapsing under the weight of it. That freedom did not make me harder. It made me clearer. The word that once followed me like a shadow no longer fits anywhere in my life. It was a story built to justify imbalance. When the imbalance ended, the story had nowhere to stand. I stopped carrying it, and it disappeared on its own. I know now that many people live the way I once did, especially women, especially daughters, especially those who are capable enough to become invisible. We are taught that love means endurance, that loyalty means silence, that boundaries are betrayal, and when we finally step back, we are told we have changed. The truth is, we have stopped disappearing. Walking away does not destroy families. It reveals them. It shows who is contributing and who was consuming. It forces responsibility to land where it belongs. That process is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not injustice. It is often the beginning of balance. My life today is quieter than it used to be, but it is also fuller. I wake up without dread. I sleep without replaying conversations. I no longer measure my worth by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how present I feel in my own skin. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this to understand, it is this. You are allowed to choose yourself without waiting for permission. You are allowed to step away from roles that drain you, even if others do not understand. And you are allowed to build a life that does not require you to be smaller, quieter, or endlessly accommodating. This story does not end with revenge or victory. It ends with ownership. Ownership of my time, my energy, my future. I am no longer waiting to be seen. I see myself clearly now, and that is enough. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something you have been carrying quietly, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more stories about boundaries, family, and the moments that quietly reshape us, subscribe and stay with this channel. Sometimes hearing one truth out loud is all it takes to begin living differently.